They say wealth doesn't shield you from the rain, it just changes the quality of the umbrella. But for billionaire heiress Evelyn Vance, her beautiful, expensive umbrella wasn't just leaking. It was about to be violently ripped away in a private Manhattan dining room full of the very investors she had spent a decade protecting. It didn't happen slowly. It happened between the second course and the pouring of a vintage Bordeaux, when her husband, as 28-year-old executive assistant, stepped up and slapped Evelyn, 7 months pregnant, right across the face. For one frozen second, the room went dead silent. But what the mistress and the unfaithful CEO didn't know was that they hadn't just struck a wife. They had just assaulted the absolute owner of the very ground they were standing on. This isn't just a story of a broken marriage or a public scandal. It is a masterclass in why you should never mistake a woman's infinite patience for absolute weakness. Today we unfold a gripping narrative of legal precision, silent dignity, and the ultimate corporate reckoning. If you believe that true power doesn't need to scream to destroy an empire, hit that like button right now. Subscribe to the channel and drop a comment below. Let's dive into the quiet storm that Nathan Vance never saw coming. They say wealth does not shield you from the rain. It just changes the quality of the umbrella. But for Evelyn Vance, her beautiful, expensive umbrella was about to be ripped away in a private dining room full of the very people she had spent a decade protecting. It was not a slow realization. It happened between the second course and the pouring of a vintage Bordeaux. The air inside the gilded apron was thick, with the scent of roasted truffles and old money. This was an exclusive sanctuary in the heart of Manhattan, a place where billionaires came to slice their steaks and divide their empires in absolute privacy. The lighting was low, cast by a crystal chandelier that dripped like frozen ice above a long mahogany table. Evelyn sat near the center of the table, her hand resting instinctively over her heavily pregnant belly. She was 7 months along, carrying a child she and her husband had fought for through 5 agonizing years of fertility treatments. She wore a simple, unbranded navy silk dress with classic pearl earrings. In a room full of flash, Evelyn was the quiet anchor. Across from her stood Clara Voss. Clara was 28 years old, possessed of sharp, predatory beauty, pale hair pulled into an aggressive bun, and a silver gown with a high slit that practically screamed for attention. She did not belong to old money, but she belonged to Nathan Vance's daily life. As Nathan's executive assistant, Clara had spent the last 2 years learning his moods, organizing his calendar, and slowly, systematically pushing her way into spaces where an assistant never belonged. Right now, Clara was standing directly over Evelyn. Her hand was still raised, the air still vibrating from the sound of her palm striking Evelyn's cheek. For one frozen second, the private dining room went completely silent. The soft melody of a violinist in the corner cut off with a screech. Crystal glasses stopped halfway to the mouths of some of the most powerful maritime investors in the country. "No manners," Clara said, her voice cutting through the silence like a blade. Her lips curled with bright, reckless contempt. "Nobody taught you how to behave at a high-stakes business dinner, Evelyn." Evelyn slowly turned her face back toward the table. Her cheek burned with a deep, furious heat, but her eyes remained completely cold. She did not cry, she did not scream. She looked down at her untouched plate, then up at the head of the table where her husband sat. Nathan Vance went pale, so fast his expression seemed to drain under the chandelier light. He was 42 years old, with silver touching his dark hair at the temples, wearing a bespoke suit cut to suggest perfect corporate discipline. For years, Nathan had projected the image of a self-made titan. He was the CEO of Vance Logistics, a massive shipping firm currently trying to finalize a multi-million-dollar merger with Cross Continental. But Nathan was not self-made. He was funded entirely by the Vance Maritime Trust, a private financial powerhouse that belonged exclusively to Evelyn and his family. Nathan's hand jerked toward his water glass, knocking it against a silver knife with a loud clink. He did not look at Clara with anger. He looked at Evelyn with absolute terror, because Evelyn was standing up. Nathan said under his breath, his voice trembling as he leaned forward, "Do not." That was his first mistake. In a room full of investors, he had chosen to command his struck wife rather than reprimand his violent employee. Evelyn looked at him, her posture perfectly straight despite the heavy weight of her pregnancy. "Do not what, Nathan?" Evelyn asked. Her voice was not loud, but it carried to every corner of the mahogany table. Nathan's mouth opened, but nothing came out. He looked like a man watching a fuse burn down toward a dynamite crate. Clara laughed once, a sharp, pretty sound that broke the tension in her own mind. "See, this is exactly what I mean," Clara said, looking around at the investors for approval. "You do not even know when to stay quiet and let your husband conduct real business. You are a distraction, Evelyn." Evelyn stepped around her heavy leather chair. She was not tall, but she carried the absolute, unshakable authority of generations of inherited power. She did not look at Clara's glittering silver dress. She looked at the woman's eyes. Evelyn did not lift her hand in a while. emotional swing. Her movement was precise, measured, and perfectly executed. The sound of her palm striking Clara's face cracked through the room like a judge gavel. Clara stumbled back one full step, her high heels catching on the heavy carpet. She clutched her reddening cheek, her eyes widening in absolute disbelief, then burning with raw fury. Nathan shot to his feet so quickly his heavy chair slammed into the wood-paneled wall behind him. "Are you insane, Evelyn?" he hissed, stepping forward with his hands raised. Evelyn did not look at Clara. She kept her eyes locked entirely on her husband. "That is an interesting question, Nathan," she said, her voice deadly calm. "Would you like to ask it again after I introduce myself to our guests properly?" The investors at the table shifted uncomfortably. Daniel Cross, a silver-haired titan of the shipping industry whose capital could make or break Nathan's merger, leaned back and crossed his arms. His eyes darted from Nathan to Evelyn, recognizing a dynamic he had not been told about. For 10 years, Nathan had told the business world that his wife was a quiet, private woman who preferred to stay home and focus on interior design and charity luncheons. He had treated her like a decorative asset, a prop to make conservative investors feel comfortable. He had never told them that the quiet woman he corrected in front of waiters controlled the private trust that had kept his company alive through 2 failed expansions, a massive supply chain lawsuit, and the very acquisition dinner they were attending tonight. He had never told Clara, either, and Clara, still holding her burning cheek, had just assaulted the woman who owned the very ground she was standing on. Nathan's breathing was shallow. He looked around the room, trying to find his public relations smile, but the mask had cracked completely. "Please, Evelyn," Nathan muttered, his voice dropping into a desperate whisper. "Think about the merger. Think about our family. Think about the baby." Evelyn looked down at her pregnant belly, then back at Nathan. "I am thinking about the baby, Nathan, and for the first time in my life, I am seeing clearly exactly what kind of father she would have had." The dinner had been planned as Nathan's ultimate victory lap. That was how he had described it to his executive board, though to Evelyn he had used a completely different tone. To her, he had called it a tedious but necessary business obligation, asking her to attend merely because conservative investors like Daniel Cross felt more comfortable when a family man stood at the helm. Evelyn remembered the conversation from 3 hours earlier. She had been standing in front of the vanity in their penthouse master suite, carefully fastening a pair of classic pearl earrings. Nathan was standing behind her, adjusting the gold cufflinks she had given him for their 5th anniversary. He did not look at her face. He looked at his own reflection, checking the symmetry of his tie. "Will Clara be there tonight?" Evelyn had asked quietly, her eyes meeting his through the glass. The cufflink paused between his fingers for a fraction of a second before he slid it through the starched linen. "She organized the dinner, Evelyn. Of course she will be there. She is my executive assistant." "That was not my question, Nathan. I asked if she would be attending as a guest at the table." Nathan's expression sharpened in the mirror, his brow furrowing with immediate irritation. "Do not start tonight, Evelyn. Please. I am under an immense amount of pressure with the cross-continental merger. I need one evening without your passive-aggressive tension." Evelyn picked up her small evening clutch. There it was, the old familiar trick Nathan had perfected over the last 5 years. Whenever she asked a direct question about his boundaries or his staff, he turned the question into an accusation of jealousy before it could become evidence of his own misconduct. "I am asking, Nathan, because your assistant has recently taken it upon herself to screen calls from my family office," Evelyn said, her voice steady. "The Vance Maritime Trust is currently reviewing your application for a financing extension. I find it unusual that an assistant is handling corporate communications that deal directly with my family's capital." Nathan turned around from the mirror, his jaw flexing. "It is not your family office. Evelyn, let us be accurate. The trust is managed by a board of professional financial advisors. You do not sit up there with a crown on your head, deciding who gets to eat in this city." "No," Evelyn said softly, looking him in the eye. "I do not wear a crown. I read risk assessment reports. Crowns are highly inefficient." Nathan gave a short, humorless laugh and checked his watch. "This is exactly why I need you to remain calm and quiet tonight. These old money investors do not need your little remarks or your analytical oversight. They want to see a supportive, stable family. They want to see my wife being a wife." Evelyn stood up, her pregnancy changing the way she balanced her weight, but her dignity remained unyielding. "Do you need a wife there tonight, Nathan, or do you simply need a prop?" Nathan groaned, grabbing his suit jacket from the bed. "I need an evening where we look like a team. Clara knows exactly how these high-stakes events work. She has handled the seating, the menu, and the investor briefs. If you find yourself unsure of what to say or how to navigate the conversation, just follow her lead. She knows my preferences better than anyone right now." That was the exact moment the final piece of the puzzle fell into place for Evelyn. She realized that Nathan had not merely become careless or deeply unfaithful with Clara. He had become comfortable. He had become completely satisfied letting his mistress manage his wife. Evelyn had said nothing more during the car ride to the Gilded Apron. Nathan had mistaken her absolute silence for compliance. Men who are blinded by their own ambition almost always make that mistake. They assume that because a woman does not scream, she has accepted her defeat. They forget that the quietest ocean currents are the ones that carry the power to erode entire cliffsides. As the Blacktown car slipped through the rain-slicked streets of Manhattan, Evelyn had quietly opened her phone and sent a single text message to Arthur Pendleton, her family's chief legal counsel. The message read, "Arthur, I want the full compliance audit on Vance Logistics finalized by midnight. Do not wait for the morning board meeting." Clara Voss had entered Vance Logistics as a standard executive assistant and had promoted herself socially within 6 months. She was intelligent, but her intelligence was not the kind used to build companies. It was the kind used to exploit the vulnerabilities of weak men. She learned Nathan's schedule first, then his moods, and finally, his profound insecurities. By the end of her first year, Clara could anticipate Nathan's preferences before he even named them. She knew exactly which dark roast coffee he required before a hostile board call. She knew which specific single malt whiskey to pour after a day of bad press. She ensured his private travel suites always faced east because she knew he loved taking sunrise photos to send to his private investors as proof of his relentless work ethic. She laughed at his sharpest, meanest jokes and looked deeply wounded whenever he thanked her too casually, making him feel like an essential protector. Nathan called her indispensable to the company. Evelyn, however, recognized that behavior as the first classic warning sign of corporate and personal rot. Indispensable employees certainly existed, but indispensable assistants who began choosing a CEO's tie, screening his wife's personal calls, and sitting beside him at private dinners were an entirely different category of risk. Clara was beautiful in a highly polished, aggressive way, with pale hair, clever, calculating eyes, and a distinct talent for turning professional service into profound personal intimacy. She was careful to address Evelyn as Mrs. Vance in public, but in private she used her first name with a cold familiarity, as if intimacy with Nathan gave her a rank that superseded Evelyn's marriage. The first time Clara had openly corrected Evelyn, it had been over something as small as floral arrangements. Evelyn had chosen soft pink peonies for a small charity dinner hosted at their penthouse. When she arrived at the venue early, she found Clara instructing the florist to tear them down and replace them with stark white orchids. "Nathan prefers white orchids at official corporate events," Clara had said, smiling with sweet condescension. "He finds pink peonies far too sentimental and domestic." Evelyn had looked at the younger woman calmly. "This is my dining room, Clara, and this is my family's private charity event." Clara's smile had not wavered. "Of course, Mrs. Vance. I only mean that if Nathan is comfortable, the investors are comfortable. I am just looking out for his peace of mind." That was Clara's true gift. She disguised every single act of boundary invasion as an act of selfless care for Nathan's corporate success. The second incident had occurred during a major foundation luncheon. Evelyn was speaking with a trusted maritime supplier about a logistics contract when Clara stepped directly between them, handing the supplier a new set of terms. "Nathan asked that all vendor decisions and contract reviews run directly through my desk from now on," Clara said. Evelyn frowned slightly. "For his corporate office, perhaps, but this is my family's private maritime foundation." Clara's eyes had cooled, her smile thinning into a sharp line. "Nathan said you would understand." "Evelyn, he feels the family assets need a more modern, professional touch." Evelyn did understand. She understood completely that Clara was testing the walls of her marriage and her position. She also knew that Nathan was actively permitting it. But Evelyn was a woman trained in the ruthless world of private equity and family trust management. She knew that if she reacted too early, if she threw a tantrum or demanded Clara's termination without ironclad proof, Nathan would immediately weaponize her reaction. He would call her jealous, insecure, or hormonal due to her difficult IVF treatments. So, Evelyn did what any seasoned investor would do. She documented everything. She waited patiently. She watched for the inevitable pattern of human greed to reveal its true financial value, and it did. Within months, Clara's name began appearing on expense approvals far outside her role as an assistant. There were luxury travel upgrades, personal styling fees billed as corporate consulting, and massive retainers paid to a marketing agency owned entirely by Clara's first cousin. Evelyn discovered a corporate security passcoded with broad server access that no administrative assistant should ever possess. Most damning of all, she found bills for luxury floral arrangements delivered to Nathan's private pied-à-terre in New York on the exact nights he claimed to be attending transportation conferences in Washington. Evelyn did not confront him. Confrontation without absolute leverage simply gives a liar time to rehearse a better alibi. Instead, she quietly instructed the Hartwell Investment Committee to commission a comprehensive, independent governance review of Vance Logistics. She had hoped the truth would be smaller than her dread. She had hoped Nathan was just foolish, not entirely corrupt, but by the time she walked into the Gilded Apron that evening, Evelyn already knew enough to dissolve the marriage. What she had not expected was the sheer, reckless arrogance that would lead Clara to put a hand across her face. The dinner at the Gilded Apron was held in a private room that overlooked the Manhattan skyline through a massive wall of seamless glass. Below, the city traffic moved like red and white stitches through the bitter winter dark. Inside, the room was a sanctuary of perfect, expensive peace. The long mahogany table was set with ivory linens, low-burning beeswax candles, and the floral arrangements Clara had chosen herself, white orchids. Evelyn had noticed the flowers the moment she walked in, and she had almost smiled. Predictable people are incredibly useful in a legal dispute. They leave their fingerprints on everything, choosing style over strategy every single time. Nathan was at the door, greeting his high-profile guests with his practiced, charismatic warmth. He touched elbows, remembered the names of the investors' children, and spoke with the relaxed, effortless urgency of a man who believed he was hours away from a historic deal. The merger with Cross Continental was supposed to absorb a struggling logistics software firm called Northline Systems. The acquisition required massive bridge financing, and that bridge depended entirely on the continued confidence of the Hartwell Trust Network. Most people in that room believed Nathan had brought Evelyn along because her historic family name still opened doors that new money could never touch. Only 3 people in the world knew that Evelyn did not merely carry the name. She was the actual chair of the Hartwell Private Investment Committee. She alone held the legal authority to sign off on the financing extension, or let the entire deal collapse by morning. Nathan knew. His chief financial officer, Adrian Cole, knew, in Evelyn's personal counsel, Mary Ann Shaw, who was currently sitting 2 tables away in the main restaurant pretending to enjoy a solitary dinner, knew. Clara Voss did not know, and that ignorance made her dangerously bold. Clara floated around the room in her glittering silver silk gown, touching Nathan's sleeve at regular intervals, bending close to his ear to whisper schedule updates, and laughing at his private comments with the effortless ease of a woman who believed she had already won the territory. She actively placed herself between Evelyn and the senior investors twice during the cocktail hour. She had even corrected the seating cards, moving Evelyn's nameplate farther down the table and placing herself directly at Nathan's right hand. Evelyn watched the subtle movements with cold clinical detachment. Nathan saw the change happen as well. He looked at his wife's nameplate sitting far from his own, then looked at Clara's triumphant smile. He did nothing to correct it. At exactly 8:12 in the evening, as the guests were taking their seats, Clara leaned down beside Evelyn's chair. Her perfume was overwhelming, a heavy, expensive scent that made Evelyn's pregnancy nausea flare slightly. "You are sitting in Daniel Cross's designated seat, Evelyn," Clara said, her voice dropping into a low, sharp whisper. Evelyn looked at the silver-embossed card directly in front of her plate. It clearly read Mrs. Evelyn Vance. "No, Clara," she said calmly. "I am sitting exactly where the reservation specified." Clara's professional smile remained fixed on her face, but her eyes turned like ice. "Nathan needs Daniel Cross directly next to him for the financing conversation tonight. Surely you understand how critical this merger is for your husband's future. You wouldn't want to get in the way of his success." "Then Nathan can ask me to move himself," Evelyn replied. "Nathan asked me to handle the table arrangements," Clara hissed, her fingers tightening around the polished wood of Evelyn's chair. "Do not embarrass him in front of his partners tonight, Evelyn." There it was again. The exact phrase Clara had borrowed from Nathan's vocabulary of emotional manipulation. "Do not embarrass him." As if the greatest public danger in a room full of titans was a pregnant wife simply refusing to be hidden away like an inconvenient secret. Evelyn placed her linen napkin firmly across her lap. "You may return to your own seat now, Clara." Clara stared down at her for one long, furious second. Then she turned on her heel and walked away, her silver dress swishing aggressively. Evelyn recognized that look. It was the expression of an ambitious woman who had decided that quiet disrespect was no longer sufficient. Clara had just chosen total escalation. The first course was served under a social pressure so polished it almost resembled genuine elegance. Nathan stood up and gave a short, brilliant speech about vision, timing, and corporate discipline. The investors nodded in rhythm. The directors lifted their crystal glasses. Clara sat at his right hand, a slim electronic tablet resting beside her plate. Though no one else in the room had brought corporate work to a formal dinner, Evelyn sat 3 seats down, listening without a single trace of emotion on her face. She remembered a time when she had genuinely loved Nathan's speeches, in the early days of their marriage. His intense ambition had sounded like vital movement. He described large logistics companies as living engines, global markets as unpredictable weather, and human relationships as essential bridges. He possessed a rare gift for making financial risk feel like a noble, heroic adventure. Evelyn had believed in him because she saw not only what he wanted to build, but what he desperately lacked: stability, patience, and financial discipline. He needed someone who could tell him no before the market did. She had become that person, and then he had begun to hate her for it. The soup arrived. Clara leaned over toward Daniel Cross, her voice carrying clearly across the quiet clinking of silver spoon against porcelain. Nathan has been carrying the weight of this entire merger almost completely alone, Clara said, her tone light but pointed. It is tragic that some people at home simply do not understand the immense sacrifice true leadership requires. The words were wrapped in the guise of casual praise for a boss, but they were aimed directly at Evelyn. Daniel Cross glanced down the table at Evelyn, looking visibly uncomfortable. I imagine a multi-billion-dollar merger is demanding on any family, Cross murmured carefully. Clara laughed softly, a sound that lacked any real warmth. Well, some families support leadership much better than others. Some people just enjoy the status without ever understanding the work. Nathan looked down at his soup, completely silent. He did not defend his wife. He did not correct his assistant. Evelyn set her spoon down with perfect, silent control. The small sound of the metal hitting the porcelain seemed to draw the attention of the immediate seats. Clara, Evelyn said, her voice perfectly even and clear, when you refer to people at home who do not understand real business, are you referring directly to me? The entire mahogany table went dead still. An investor who was about to take a sip of wine froze, his glass hovering inches from his lips. Clara blinked, her polished smile faltering for a fraction of a second before she recovered her footing. I was speaking generally about the challenges of executive spouses. Mrs. Vance, Clara said, her voice tightening. Then I suggest you speak generally with much better manners. Evelyn replied, this is a private financing dinner, not a soap opera audition. A tiny muffled sound escaped one of the executive wives near the far end of the table, almost a laugh. Clara heard it clearly, her face flushed a deep, violent red beneath her expensive makeup. Nathan's eyes snapped instantly to Evelyn, his gaze full of a warning. Hostile anger. Evelyn met his look with absolute calm. Clara lifted her wine glass, her hand shaking slightly, and set it down hard enough to cause the red liquid to slosh against the rim. Perhaps I should explain something to you. Evelyn, high-stakes dinners like this require absolute discipline. They are not local charity lunches where everyone claps for you simply because your family name happens to be printed on the invitation. Some of us actually earn our place at this table through relentless work. Evelyn tilted her head slightly, her pearls catching the light. You are attempting to explain business discipline to me, Clara. Nathan finally murmured, Clara, please. But his tone was not a reprimand. It was a plea for caution. It was not stop insulting my wife. It was simply not here, not in front of Cross. Clara heard the profound weakness in Nathan's voice and mistook it for absolute permission. She stood up, her chair scraping loudly against the hardwood floor. No, Nathan, she said, her voice rising to a pitch that commanded the entire room. I am completely tired of watching people disrespect the brilliant work you do for this firm. Some of us actually contribute to the value of Grand Meridian. Clara walked around the long mahogany table, her silver dress catching the light, and stopped directly in front of Evelyn's chair. Before anyone in the room could realize her intent, Clara raised her hand and slapped the pregnant woman across the face. After Evelyn slapped Clara back, the private dining room divided into three distinct kinds of people. There were those who were completely shocked that a pregnant wife had been struck at a formal dinner. There were those who were utterly stunned that she had struck back with such icy precision. And then there were those who suddenly looked at Nathan and wondered what he knew that made him look like a man facing a firing squad. Daniel Cross was the first person to break the silence. Nathan, what the absolute hell is going on here? The Titan demanded, his voice booming through the room. Nathan did not answer him. He stepped toward Evelyn with both of his hands lifted in a placating, defensive gesture that made Evelyn's stomach turn with deep physical disgust. He used to use that exact same gesture when he was calming down angry warehouse union reps or nervous investors. Open palms, a soft, soothing voice, and eyes trained entirely on the source of the disruption. Tonight, however, the disruption was not Clara's violence. The problem, in Nathan's eyes, was Evelyn's total refusal to absorb the blow in silence. Evelyn, Nathan said quietly, his voice pleading as he stepped closer. Please, we can handle this completely privately. Let us just step outside. Evelyn looked at Clara, whose left cheek had already begun to swell into a dark, angry red under the force of Evelyn's precise strike. She made this public, Nathan. She lost control of herself. And so did you, according to the optics of this room. Nathan hissed under his breath, his eyes darting toward the investors. That is exactly what you should have protected. Clara's eyes flashed with a wild, desperate fury as she clutched her face. Protected. Nathan, she has been embarrassing you and undermining your authority all night. Evelyn finally turned her entire body toward the younger woman, her hand remaining firmly over her pregnant belly. Clara, you just publicly assaulted a guest at a formal investor dinner. You are an employee of this firm. I am his partner in this work, Clara shouted, her voice cracking. You are just his wife. You are acting like a victim to get sympathy. Evelyn's gaze cooled into something that resembled absolute zero. No, Clara, I am not acting like a victim. I am acting like a witness. That single word seemed to instantly shift the entire air in the room. Nathan heard it and went completely rigid. Witness meant an official corporate record. Witness meant a formal legal statement. Witness meant that Evelyn was no longer operating inside the private, manipulative language of their marriage, where men like Nathan regularly renamed severe emotional harm as simple domestic tension. The heavy doors of the private dining room opened, and the restaurant manager entered, flanked by two burly security staff who had been summoned by the waiter who had fled the room the moment Clara raised her hand. Right behind them walked Marianne Shaw. Evelyn's personal counsel no longer looked like a solitary diner enjoying a quiet meal. She wore a sharp charcoal gray tailored suit, carried a slim leather folder under her arm, and looked at Clara with the terrifying calm of a professional who vastly preferred cold evidence to emotional outrage. Mrs. Vance, Marianne said, her voice cutting through the room with clinical authority. Do you wish to file an official incident report with the establishment and law enforcement? Clara stared at the new arrival, her panic finally beginning to show through her anger. Who the hell are you? Marianne did not even afford Clara a glance. I am chief counsel for the Hartwell Investment Committee. Nathan's voice sharpened into a desperate panic. Marianne, please, not now. We can settle this internally tomorrow morning. Evelyn allowed a tiny, humorless smile to touch her lips. Nathan had forgotten the most basic, fundamental rule of absolute power. You can never command people who no longer depend on your comfort for their livelihood. Yes, Marianne, Evelyn said, her voice steady and clear. I want a full incident report filed immediately. I also want the restaurant management to formally preserve all digital security footage from this room, the corridor and the entry area. Clara's face went completely white. Nathan's expression changed even more drastically. Evelyn, he whispered, stepping closer, his hands trembling. Please, I am begging you, do not do this. But the word please always comes far too late when the foundation has already turned to dust. The investors watched Nathan Vance beg his pregnant wife not to preserve the physical evidence of her assault. That single act of public desperation did far more damage to his corporate credibility than the actual physical altercation had. A sudden burst of violence from an assistant could be explained away as poor judgment, an emotional outburst, or a private personal conflict spilling over into a professional space. But a CEO's raw, visible fear of security footage made every single billionaire in that room ask the exact same question at the exact same time. What else was on that footage? Evelyn knew the answer completely. She knew that the security cameras would show Clara entering the restaurant through the private executive elevator with Nathan an hour before the dinner. Despite Nathan telling his wife that he would be arriving directly from a late-stage board meeting across town, the footage would show Clara adjusting Nathan's silk tie near the bar, her fingers lingering on his collar for far too long. It would show Nathan touching the small of Clara's back while they were speaking to Daniel Cross in the lounge. Small things, each easily explainable if taken completely alone. But when woven together by a skilled divorce attorney, they formed a clear, undeniable language of deep betrayal. But tonight's footage mattered for far more than a standard marital affair. It officially placed Clara Voss at a high-stakes financing dinner as an unauthorized, undisclosed participant in financial discussions that directly affected companies currently under a formal governance review by the Hartwell Trust. It proved she had attempted to alter seating arrangements for major capital partners. It documented a public assault on a trust officer. And it recorded a CEO actively attempting to minimize a physical crime in front of federal witnesses. A standard marital scandal was emotional. A total governance failure, however, was exceptionally expensive. Marianne Shaw spoke to the restaurant manager in a low, authoritative murmur. The manager nodded quickly, his face grim. No high-end establishment in Manhattan wanted to be the venue that accidentally lost security footage of a billionaire trust inheritor being struck by a CEO's mistress. Clara took a desperate step toward Nathan, her silver dress rustling. Nathan, tell them this is absolutely ridiculous. Tell them to throw this crazy woman out. Nathan did not look at her. He could not even bring himself to turn his head in her direction. That was the exact moment Clara Voss finally understood the brutal reality of her position. Her place at his right hand had depended entirely on rooms where Evelyn chose to remain quiet. The very second Evelyn began speaking in the language of legal and financial consequence, Clara ceased to be a romantic partner or an indispensable asset. She became a massive corporate liability. Nathan, Clara said, her voice dropping into a soft, terrified plea. Nathan flinched physically at the sound of her voice. Evelyn watched that flinch and felt the very last piece of her love for him turn to absolute ash. He did not flinch because he feared losing Clara. He flinched because he feared being publicly seen choosing her over his money. Daniel Cross stood up from the table, adjusting his tailored suit jacket. "I think we are completely done here tonight," he said, his voice cold and final. Nathan turned instantly, his face frantic. "Daniel, please, wait. This unfortunate personal incident has absolutely nothing to do with the strength of the Northline acquisition or the value of Grand Meridian." Daniel Cross looked at Clara, then at Evelyn's reddening cheek, and finally back at Nathan. "You just allowed your administrative assistant to strike the chair of the investment committee whose financial support you need to survive the morning. And you honestly believe that has nothing to do with your judgment as a leader." The entire room seemed to tilt on its axis. Clara's lips parted in utter shock. Several corporate heads snapped toward Evelyn. Nathan closed his eyes, his shoulders slumping. The great secret was not announced with a dramatic flourish. It entered through Daniel Cross' profound irritation and sat down at the table like it had always belonged there. Evelyn Vance was not merely a supportive wife. She was the absolute ruler of his financial destiny. "Chair of what?" Clara whispered, her voice shaking as she looked around the silent mahogany table. Nobody answered her immediately. That heavy silence was its own brutal education. Evelyn picked up her linen napkin, folded it with perfect precision, and placed it neatly beside her untouched plate. Her cheeks still burned with a deep heat, and her palm tingled from the force of striking Clara back. Her heartbeat was perfectly steady now, not because she felt no anger, but because her anger had finally found an absolute direction. Daniel Cross exhaled loudly through his nose. "She is the chair of the Hartwell Private Investment Committee. Clara, the people who actually fund the ground you are standing on." Clara looked from Daniel to Nathan, her eyes wide with panic. "Nathan, that is not true. You told me she was just a domestic housewife. You told me she had no say in the company operations." Nathan said absolutely nothing. He stood like a statue under the crystal chandelier. "Nathan," Clara demanded, her voice rising in hysteria, "answer me." Still, Nathan remained completely silent. Adrian Cole, the chief financial officer of Grand Meridian, leaned forward, his face tight with absolute dread. "Clara, for the love of God, stop talking right now." It was the very first sensible sentence anyone from Nathan's executive team had spoken all evening. Clara turned on the CFO, her fingers clawing at her silver dress. You all knew about this." Adrian looked completely miserable, refusing to meet her eyes. "Everyone who needed to know the financial structure of the merger knew." Clara. Clara gave a broken, hysterical laugh, her eyes darting back to Evelyn. "Everyone except me." Evelyn looked directly at Nathan, her expression completely unreadable. "That seems to be a profound habit of yours, Nathan. Keeping the women who support you completely in the dark until it is too late." Nathan finally found his voice, though it sounded thin and hollow. "Evelyn, please, we should not do this here. Not in front of our investors." "You are entirely right, Nathan," Evelyn said, her voice echoing through the quiet room. "We should not have had to." She turned her head toward Mary Ann Shaw. Mary Ann opened her slim leather folder and removed a single crisp page of parchment. "Mrs. Vance, Hartwell Trust received the preliminary governance review from the independent auditors this afternoon," Mary Ann announced clearly. "Given the severe nature of tonight's public incident, the committee may officially recommend an immediate suspension of all bridge financing for the Northline acquisition, pending a full formal board review tomorrow morning at 7 o'clock. Nathan's face hardened, his desperation turning into an ugly, defensive anger. "You cannot legally do that based on a petty personal dispute. Evelyn, the trust has a fiduciary duty to the merger agreement." Evelyn turned her entire body to face him, her hand still resting protectively over her child. "This is not personal enough for you. Nathan, your mistress just assaulted your pregnant wife at a restricted corporate financing dinner. Let us be purely technical. Your executive assistant attended a confidential financial dinner without a formal disclosure of her personal relationship to the CEO. She actively attempted to influence the seating arrangements of capital partners. She then committed a physical assault on the chair of the investment committee, and you as CEO actively discouraged the preservation of physical evidence in front of federal witnesses. That is all before we begin to discuss the $4 million in expense irregularities our auditors found in Claris offshore accounts this afternoon." Claris' eyes widened to their absolute limits. "Expense irregularities? What are you talking about?" Nathan's voice dropped into a dark, desperate growl. "Enough, Evelyn, stop." "No, Nathan," Evelyn said, her voice dropping to a whisper that commanded more authority than his shout ever could. "That word belongs completely to me now." Clara Voss was officially escorted from the private dining room of the Gilded Apron through a narrow side corridor used for high-profile guests who needed to avoid the public eye. She tried to maintain her dignity at first. She threw her shoulders back, lifted her chin high, and let her silver gown flash under the recessed hallway lights. But that fragile performance lasted only until she looked up and saw the restaurant's security camera dome mounted directly above the executive elevator. She realized with a sickening thud in her stomach that the building had just recorded her disgrace from more angles than the dining room had. "I want my evening bag right now." Clara snapped at the security staff. Helena, the restaurant's veteran security manager, kept walking down the corridor without slowing her pace. "Your personal belongings will be brought down to you at the curb." "Miss Voss." "I am not a criminal," Clara shouted, her voice echoing off the polished mirrors lining the walls. "You have absolutely no right to treat me like this." "Nobody has called you a criminal yet," Helena replied, her voice filled with absolute professional boredom. "Then why are you forcing me out through the service exit?" Helena stopped near the heavy metal doors of the exit corridor and looked Clara up and down with deep disdain. "Because you just committed a physical assault against a pregnant guest in our main dining room. We do not tolerate that level of classless behavior here." Clara's face twisted into a mask of pure rage. "She hit me too, you all saw it, she struck me back."
"After you struck her, Miss Voss."
Helena noted coldly. "She provoked me. She has been undermining Nathan's authority all night." With a bowl of soup, a waiter standing nearby murmured, quickly looking down to hide a sharp smile. Clara's humiliation sharpened into a cold, terrifying panic as the heavy metal doors opened. The private executive elevator arrived with a soft chime. Inside stood two members of Grand Meridian's corporate security team. Neither of them looked eager to stand anywhere near her. They kept their eyes fixed straight ahead. Clara turned back toward the corridor, her voice trembling. "I need to speak to Nathan right now. Tell him to come out here. He will want me by his side." "Mr. Vance is currently occupied with his investors and legal counsel," Helena said, her hand resting firmly on the elevator door sensor. "He will not be joining you." "He needs me," Clara cried out, her confidence evaporating completely into the cold night air. Nobody answered her. The heavy elevator doors began to close, cutting off her view of the polished corridor. That was the exact moment Clara Voss learned the most brutal, unyielding law of corporate proximity. Being close to absolute power is never the same thing as actually possessing it. She had mistaken Nathan's physical desire for protection, his private whispers for permanent status, and her access to his schedule for genuine loyalty. But the very second she became financially costly, the man who had permitted her to trample his wife did not even bother to follow her out to the street. Inside the ruined dining room, Nathan was still frantically trying to save the wreckage of his life's work. "Daniel, please, look at my operational record over the last decade. You know what I am capable of achieving with this merger." Daniel Cross had not sat back down. He stood near the window, looking down at the rainy streets. "I know enough about your operational record to request immediate distance from your firm." "Nathan." "From me?" Nathan asked, his voice cracking. "From your absolute instability," Cross replied. Nathan turned to the remaining investors at the table, his eyes wild. "Are we seriously going to pretend that a minor domestic incident at a dinner table reflects the actual corporate value of Grand Meridian Holdings?" Evelyn answered the question before any investor could open their mouth. "Company value always includes the baseline judgment of its leadership." "Nathan, you do not run my company." "Evelyn," Nathan shouted, turning on her with raw hatred. "No," Evelyn said, her voice remaining perfectly serene as she adjusted her pearl earrings. "I simply evaluate whether the Hartwell Capital Trust should continue to support it." Nathan gave a short, low, and incredibly bitter laugh. "There she is, the real you, the cold, calculating monster behind the Quiet Wife Act." Evelyn looked him dead in the eye, her posture unbroken. "Yes, Nathan, this is the real me." The utter simplicity of her answer completely stripped the insult away from him. Nathan's expression flickered from anger to absolute defeat. For years, he had spoken to his associates as if Evelyn's high-level financial competence were something he merely tolerated in private but had to carefully conceal from the public eye. Now that exact competence stood directly in front of him under the bright chandelier light, witnessed by every single person he had spent his entire life trying to impress. He absolutely hated her for it, and yet he desperately needed her to save him. That was the official beginning of his complete collapse. The first frantic telephone call from Grand Meridian's board of directors arrived before the dessert course would have even been cleared from the mahogany table. Nathan stepped into the dimly lit corridor with his chief financial officer, Adrian Cole, leaving Evelyn in the dining room with Mary Ann Shaw and the few investors who had not yet fled the scene. The hallway was lined with dark, polished mirrors, each one reflecting Nathan's pale face from a different, unflattering angle. He looked at his reflection and absolutely despised every single version of himself he saw. The phone screen lit up with the name of Helen Ward, the formidable chair of the Grand Meridian Board of Directors. Nathan answered it with a trembling thumb. "Helen, I can explain everything." "Nathan," Helen Ward interrupted, her voice carrying the terrifying calm of a leader who had already been thoroughly briefed by her own legal team. "Tell me the report I just received from Daniel Cross is an absolute exaggeration. Tell me your assistant did not just assault Evelyn Vance at a formal financing dinner." Nathan pressed two fingers hard against his temple, feeling a massive headache forming. "There was a brief, highly unfortunate incident, Helen. But Clara was reacting to severe provocation from Evelyn." Adrian Cole closed his eyes tightly, leaning his head against the wood paneling. Helen's silence on the other end of the line was far worse than any shouting could have been. "Do you honestly hear yourself right now, Nathan?" "Helen, I need you to focus on the bigger picture," Nathan pleaded, his voice dropping into a frantic whisper. "The Northline acquisition cannot pause simply because my wife and my assistant had a personal disagreement over dinner." "A disagreement?" Helen hissed. "Nathan, your executive assistant committed a physical assault against the chair of your primary financing committee in front of your largest capital partners." "Evelyn is my wife, Helen," Nathan shouted defensively. "That does not make her any less the chair of Hartwell." "Nathan," Helen snapped back. The words landed with immense weight because they came from Helen Ward, not from Evelyn. Nathan had survived for years by carefully separating Evelyn's roles into neat, isolated boxes: donor, family name, private advisor. He opened whichever box was useful to him at the time and locked the others away whenever they threatened his ego. Tonight, however, every single box had opened at once, and the contents were suffocating him. Helen continued, her voice cold as ice. "The board will convene for an emergency meeting tomorrow morning at exactly 7 o'clock. You will immediately preserve all digital communications involving Clara Voss, the Hartwell Trust, Northline Systems, and any expense approvals related to tonight's event. This is completely unnecessary." "Helen, you are overreacting to simple bad optics." "Nathan," Helen said right before the line went dead, "I am reacting to massive material risk." Nathan lowered the phone, his hand shaking. Adrian Cole spoke carefully from the shadows. "We need to get ahead of the public relations narrative immediately. Nathan, we need crisis management. Do not start using that dramatic crisis language with me." "Adrian," Nathan snapped, turning on him. "It was just a dinner. It was a dinner where your mistress assaulted your pregnant wife and exposed a massive federal governance review in front of your investors," Adrian said, his voice exhausted. "Whose side are you even on, Nathan?" Nathan stared at him, his jaw dropped. "I am on the side of this company." Adrian looked at his boss with deep pity. "I am on the side of the company too." "Nathan, the problem is, that used to be the exact same thing as being on your side. Not anymore." From behind them, Evelyn's voice cut through the dark corridor. "That is the ultimate problem with making yourself the entire company, Nathan. Eventually, the people around you have to choose which one survives the wreck." Nathan turned around. Evelyn stood at the entrance of the corridor, her coat already buttoned over her pregnant belly, Mary Ann Shaw by her side. Her left cheek was noticeably swollen, but she had not tried to hide it with makeup. The mark was completely visible to the world, and so was the fact that she was still standing perfectly straight. Nathan tried to force Evelyn to let him drive her home. That was his very next critical mistake. He approached her outside the restaurant on the rain-slicked sidewalk, where a line of Blacktown cars sat idling at the curb and the freezing winter air sharpened the edges of everyone's breath. The investors were slipping away in quiet, hushed clusters, refusing to look back. Daniel Cross walked up to Evelyn, gently kissed her uninjured cheek, and looked directly at Nathan. "Do not let him reduce the magnitude of tonight," Evelyn Cross said before stepping into his car. Nathan's jaw tightened until it clicked. "My car is parked right here," Evelyn, he said, reaching for her arm. "Let us get in." Evelyn stepped back, avoiding his touch entirely as she buttoned her wool coat. "So is my car, Nathan. We are still married. That is a binding legal fact, not a transportation plan." Mary Ann Shaw coughed softly into her glove, clearly hiding her amusement. "Evelyn, please," Nathan hissed, stepping closer so the drivers could not hear him. "We need to talk about this without a massive audience. Do not turn this into a dramatic theatrical performance." Evelyn looked at him with an expression that bordered on absolute pity. "Nathan, your assistant just slapped me in a private dining room during the most important investor dinner of your career. The theater opened tonight without my permission. You were the executive producer." His face flushed a deep, ugly purple. "Clara was completely wrong. That was a terrible mistake, and I admit it. I will handle her employment status first thing in the morning. I promise." "No, Nathan," Evelyn said, her voice dropping into a chilling register. "You do not. What do you mean? No, I am the CEO. I mean that you do not get to handle a woman you actively empowered to humiliate me for 2 years, Evelyn said. The Human Resource Department can handle her employment termination. The police can handle the formal incident report. My legal counsel can handle the official corporate record, and I will handle myself. Nathan looked around the sidewalk frantically. The private drivers were watching them through their rearview mirrors while pretending to be entirely absorbed in their phones. The building doorman stared straight ahead into the rain with heroic, unbroken discipline. You are actually enjoying this, aren't you, Nathan said, his voice dripping with sudden bitterness. You love seeing me beg on the street. Evelyn's eyes changed, turning from cold ice to something heavy and profound. No, Nathan, I do not enjoy this at all. I enjoyed the first years of our marriage, before you began mistaking my infinite patience for an endless corporate resource. I genuinely enjoyed building a life with the man I believed you were. I enjoyed using my family's wealth to help your company survive when every single commercial bank in this city refused to touch your debt. Tonight is not enjoyment. Nathan, tonight is an accounting. Before Nathan could formulate a reply, her car arrived at the curb. It was a massive, dark armored sedan driven by a private security officer Nathan had never seen before in his life. The sight deeply unsettled him. He had truly believed he knew every single boundary of Evelyn's quiet life, her clothing choices, her favorite charities, her family-sold estate, her small, understated office. He had completely forgotten that private does not mean empty. As she opened the car door, Nathan made one final desperate play. If you freeze the Hartwell funding tomorrow morning, thousands of innocent logistics employees will suffer because of a personal marital dispute. Evelyn paused, her hand on the heavy door. There it was. The classic hostage argument he had used in softer forms throughout their entire marriage. The company needs me. The employees depend on my vision. You cannot challenge me without destroying innocent lives. Evelyn turned back to face him one last time, the cold rain catching the pearls in her ears. Then I guess we should remove the single person creating the material risk before those innocent employees have to pay the price for his arrogance, she said. She stepped into the back seat, and the heavy door closed with a soft, expensive, and completely final thud. Clara Voss called Nathan's private cell phone 37 times that night. He finally answered on the 38th ring, his voice dead and hollow. He was standing in his corner executive office on the 50th floor, all the lights turned off, looking down at the endless grid of the bleeding city below. The massive corporate building was completely empty around him. His reflection in the glass looked like a total stranger wearing an expensive suit. Where the hell are you, Nathan? Clara demanded the moment the line connected. Why haven't you called me back? Do not call this private line ever again. Clara, Nathan said, his voice flat. There was a long, stunned silence on the other end. Excuse me. Use my legal counsel for any further communication with this office, Clara. Clara gave a sharp, hysterical laugh of utter disbelief. Legal counsel. Nathan, are you insane? I slapped that woman because she was actively humiliating you in front of Daniel Cross. I was protecting your reputation. You physically assaulted a senior capital partner of the Hartwell Trust. Clara, Nathan said, his voice completely devoid of warmth. She is your wife. Nathan, she is a domestic housewife. She is also the absolute owner of the trust that funds our entire operation. Clara, which you would have known if you spent more time studying corporate governance and less time picking out white orchids. You lied to me, Nathan, Clara shouted, her voice shaking with a dangerous, volatile anger. You let me sit there at that table like an absolute idiot. You made yourself an absolute idiot the exact second you raised your hand against a pregnant woman. Clara, the words came out far crueler than he had intended, or perhaps exactly as he truly intended. Nathan no longer knew which parts of his mind were corporate strategy and which parts were absolute rot. Clara inhaled sharply, her voice dropping into a venomous whisper. Do not you dare turn this on me, Nathan Vance. I am the only person who has been trying to save your ego from that cold woman for 2 years. You were trying to save your own social climbing ambitions. Clara, Nathan said, closing his eyes. No, Nathan. You told me she was absolutely nothing without her family name. You told me she did not understand a single thing about real, modern business. You said she only cared about appearances and charity luncheons. You said she would never, ever fight back because she was trained from birth to behave herself in public. Nathan's stomach turned completely cold. Where exactly are you right now, Clara? Why do you care? Are you afraid I am recording this call? Clara asked, her voice cracking with a broken laugh. Nathan did not answer quickly enough, and the silence confirmed her suspicion. You are terrified, aren't you? Clara hissed. Well, you should be. I lost my job tonight. I lost my reputation. And I probably lost my entire career in this city because you let me believe I had a permanent place beside you on that throne. You crossed a severe legal line. Clara, You move that line every single time you touch me in this office. Nathan, Clara shouted back. Every single expense approval you signed for my cousin S agency was a line you moved. That single sentence hit Nathan harder than any physical blow could have. He had no time to feel the emotional weight of it before the panic set in. Clara was no longer just a reckless extramarital affair. She was a hostile witness with an immense motive for revenge. Deep public humiliation and absolute digital access to months of his private messages. Do not do anything reckless, Clara, Nathan warned, his voice trembling. Like slapping your wealthy wife at a dinner party. Clara asked right before the line went dead. Nathan lowered the phone and stared at the dark screen. For the very first time that night, he understood completely that Clara Voss had been an exceptionally good student. She had learned everything about manipulation from him. She knew exactly how to turn private damage into public leverage. Evelyn Vance went home to the historic red brick townhouse in Gramercy Park that she had owned long before she ever met Nathan. She had insisted on keeping the property in her own name throughout the marriage because her grandmother had taught her a vital piece of old money wisdom from a very young age. Every single woman needs a secure door to which only she holds the key. As she stepped into the quiet, dimly lit foyer, the heavy scent of old wood and fresh lavender immediately enveloped her, instantly washing away the suffocating atmosphere of the gilded apron. Her private security officer, a trusted family employee named Marcus, carried her evening bag into the kitchen. "Would you like me to call the family physician to look at your cheek, Mrs. Vance?" Marcus asked, his tone filled with quiet, protective concern.
No, thank you, Marcus.
Evelyn said, removing her wool coat. "The swelling is already going down. I just need a cup of chamomile tea and some absolute quiet." She walked into the expansive library, where a low fire was crackling in the hearth. She sat down in a deep leather armchair, her body aching from the immense physical and emotional stress of the evening. She placed both of her hands over her belly, feeling the rhythmic, comforting kick of her daughter inside. "You are perfectly safe here, little one," Evelyn whispered into the quiet room. "The storm is outside now." Arthur Pendleton entered the library a few moments later, carrying a steaming mug of tea and a thick manila folder. He looked at her cheek and shook his head with deep, sorrowful regret. "I am so deeply sorry you had to endure that public display of vulgarity, Evelyn. Your father would be absolutely heartbroken if he were alive to see how Nathan has treated his legacy." Evelyn took a sip of the warm tea, the heat spreading through her chest. "My father was a brilliant maritime investor, Arthur, but he was also a man who desperately wanted to see his daughter married. His desire for my traditional happiness made him completely blind to Nathan's profound flaws. He wanted a son-in-law so badly that he handed a wolf the keys to the sheepfold. He did leave a safeguard, however," Arthur said, sitting down across from her and opening the folder. "The governance review is complete. The auditors have verified that Nathan has been using secondary corporate accounts to fund Miss Voss' lifestyle, masking the transfers as third-party marketing consultations. It constitutes a clear, undeniable breach of his fiduciary duty to Grand Meridian Holdings. Can he use the pregnancy clause to strip my voting rights tomorrow morning, Arthur?" Arthur adjusted his reading glasses. "Not anymore. The clause your father signed stated that your voting rights could only be transferred if you were deemed medically incapacitated or voluntarily took a leave of absence without appointing a legal proxy. Tonight, before you left the restaurant, you officially signed the proxy over to me in front of the manager and your counsel. You are not on leave, Evelyn. You are fully engaged. Nathan S. Countertrap is completely dead in the water." Evelyn leaned her head back against the leather chair, looking up at the high, book-lined ceiling. "It is a strange thing, Arthur. For 10 years, I actively shrank myself so that Nathan could feel like the giant he always wanted to be. I let him take the credit for every single successful expansion. I let him believe he was the mastermind behind the logistics empire. And the very moment I stopped shrinking, he called me a monster. That is the classic tragedy of weak men." "Evelyn," Arthur said softly, "they do not want a partner who can help them build a kingdom. They want an audience that will applaud their performance, no matter how terrible it is. Tomorrow morning at 7 o'clock, the audience leaves the theater." Evelyn closed her eyes, the warmth of the fire casting long, dancing shadows across her face. "Let the board meeting begin," she whispered. The emergency board meeting of Grand Meridian Holdings was held at 7 o'clock the following morning in a sterile glass conference room on the top floor of their corporate headquarters. The morning sun was rising over the East River, casting a bright, blinding light across the faces of the 12 board members who sat around the massive glass table. The atmosphere inside was suffocatingly tense, resembling a courtroom right before a verdict is read. Nathan Vance sat at the head of the table, his eyes bloodshot and dark circles prominent under his skin. He had not slept a single second. He had spent the entire night rehearsing his defense, weaving a complex narrative of corporate stress, assistant burnout, and domestic misunderstanding. He truly believed that if he could just deploy enough of his signature charisma, he could convince the board to delay the financing vote. Adrian Cole sat at his left hand, looking straight down at his digital tablet, completely refusing to engage in eye contact with his boss. The heavy glass door slid open, and Helen Ward walked into the room. She did not sit down. She stood at the opposite end of the table, her expression carved out of solid stone. Behind her walked Arthur Pendleton, who set up a laptop and connected it to the massive central projector screen. Nathan stood up immediately, adjusting his jacket. "Helen, members of the board, thank you for convening so quickly. Before we begin the formal review, I want to officially state that Miss Clara Voss was terminated from her employment with Grand Meridian at midnight. The corporate office has issued a full statement condemning her unacceptable actions at the dinner last night. We are handling this unfortunate personal matter with the absolute utmost seriousness." Helen Ward looked at him, her voice dripping with pure disgust. "Sit down, Nathan. Your performance is completely finished." Nathan's smile faltered, his hands tightening on the edge of the glass table. "Helen, please. Let us not allow a single emotional outburst from a former employee to destroy a multi-billion-dollar merger that this board has spent 2 years preparing for." This board did not spend 2 years preparing for a massive federal compliance investigation. "Nathan," Helen said, nodding toward Arthur. Arthur Pendleton pressed a key on his laptop, and the massive projector screen lit up with a series of bank statements, corporate expense ledgers, and encrypted text messages. Pursuant to the comprehensive governance review commissioned by the Hartwell Investment Committee, Arthur announced clearly to the room, "We have officially uncovered that over the last 18 months. CEO Nathan Vance has authorized the diversion of $4.2 million in corporate funds to an offshore entity controlled entirely by Miss Voss' family. These transactions were intentionally disguised as independent marketing consultations for our maritime shipping routes. This constitutes systematic corporate embezzlement and a direct, severe violation of SEC disclosure laws." Nathan S. Hart skipped a beat, his forehead breaking out into a cold sweat. "That is an absolute lie. Those were legitimate consulting fees for logistic optimization. Clara's family has deep ties to the shipping routes." "Then perhaps you can explain this specific message sent from your private device to Miss Voss 3 weeks ago," Arthur noted, zooming in on a line of glowing text on the screen. The text message read, "The auditors are looking at the secondary accounts. Tell your cousin to clean the invoices immediately. If Evelyn sees these numbers, the entire Northline financing bridge collapses." The glass conference room went dead silent. Not a single board member moved. Nathan looked around the table, his eyes wild with panic, but every single director looked away from him. He was completely alone in the light. "You cannot do this to me," Nathan shouted, his voice echoing off the glass walls as he slammed his hand down on the table. "I am the founder of this modern corporate structure. I am the face of Grand Meridian Logistics. Without my leadership, the cross-continental merger is completely dead." "The merger is already dead." "Nathan," Helen Ward said, her voice filled with a cold finality. "Daniel Cross called me at 6 o'clock this morning. He has officially withdrawn his firm from the acquisition contract, citing a total failure of leadership judgment and severe moral turpitude within the executive office." Nathan reeled back as if he had been physically struck, his face completely draining of color. He turned his frantic gaze toward his CFO. "Adrian, tell them. Tell them we can restructure the bridge financing through our commercial banking partners. We do not need the Hartwell Trust." Adrian Cole finally looked up from his tablet, his eyes filled with a deep, professional pity. "We cannot restructure anything. Nathan, every single commercial bank we utilize has a primary liquidity covenant that requires the continuous backing of the Hartwell Trust. The moment Evelyn Vance signs the official funding freeze, our credit lines are automatically suspended. We will not even have enough operating capital to pay our warehouse staff by the end of the week." Nathan collapsed back into his heavy leather chair, his breathing shallow and rapid. He looked like a man watching his entire life's work evaporate into the morning air. The central projector screen flickered once, and the live video feed from a luxury recovery suite at NYU Langone Hospital appeared on the wall. Evelyn Vance was sitting up in her hospital bed, her face pale but radiating a profound, unshakable, serene authority. In her arms, wrapped in a soft pink blanket, lay her newborn daughter, Victoria Vance. The stress of the previous evening had triggered early labor, but the child was completely healthy, her tiny fingers curling in the morning light. Evelyn looked through the camera lens directly at her husband. "Good morning, Nathan," she said, her voice carrying clearly through the conference room speakers. "Evelyn," Nathan cried out, leaning toward the screen, "please, look at our daughter. You cannot destroy her future because you are angry with me. Think about what you are doing to our family legacy." "I am thinking completely about her future," Nathan, Evelyn replied softly, looking down at the sleeping child in her arms. And that is exactly why I am removing her from the presence of a man who mistakes absolute exploitation for leadership. You cannot strip my authority based on a personal grudge. This is not a personal grudge, Nathan. This is a standard corporate liquidation of a toxic asset, Evelyn said. As chair of the Hartwell Investment Committee, I have officially signed the emergency financing suspension. Furthermore, as the primary beneficiary of the Vance Maritime Trust, I am officially executing our legal right to recall all outstanding capital loans effective immediately. Nathan shot to his feet, his voice cracking with a terrifying rage. I will fight you in every single family court in this state. Evelyn, I will take sole emergency custody of that child. I have the legal amendment your father signed. You are medically incapacitated in a hospital bed. I own that baby. And through her, I own your entire trust. Evelyn did not flinch at his shout. She did not even blink. She slowly looked over toward the side of her hospital bed, where a sharp, senior federal judge named Eleanor Vance Caldwell was sitting quietly with a signed legal petition in her lap. The legal amendment my father signed was officially nullified the exact second you authorized the embezzlement of corporate funds, Nath Evelyn said, her voice echoing with absolute finality. Judge Caldwell has just signed a permanent protection order and an interim sole custody decree based on the criminal assault investigation currently pending against your office. You do not own anything here. Nathan, you are completely terminated. The final collapse of Nathan Vance's empire took less than 48 hours to complete. It did not happen with a grand, dramatic trial. It happened through the quiet, relentless efficiency of the federal banking system. By Friday afternoon, the Securities and Exchange Commission had officially frozen every single personal and corporate bank account associated with Nathan Vance, pending a full criminal indictment for corporate embezzlement and wire fraud. The board of directors at Grand Meridian Holdings voted unanimously to strip Nathan of his CEO title effective immediately, replacing him with Helen Ward as interim leader. The corporate security team escorted him from the building through the basement loading dock, ensuring he did not even have the opportunity to clear out his personal desk. Evelyn Vance spent the next 2 weeks recovering in the quiet sanctuary of her Gramercy Park townhouse, surrounded by her trusted legal team and the endless support of the high society women Nathan had spent a decade dismissing as irrelevant. Her daughter Victoria thrived in the peaceful, sunlit nursery, completely shielded from the corporate warfare that had accompanied her birth. 2 years later, the setting shifted entirely away from the cold, gray glass of Manhattan to a sprawling, sun-drenched estate overlooking the ocean in Newport, Rhode Island. The bitter winter rain had been replaced by the warm, gentle breeze of a midsummer afternoon. The grass was a brilliant, lush green, sloping gently down toward a private stone terrace where waves crashed softly against the rocks below. Evelyn Vance sat in a comfortable wicker chair on the terrace, a glass of iced tea resting on the table beside her. She looked absolutely radiant, her skin glowing with the vibrant health of a woman who had completely reclaimed her own life. She wore a simple, elegant white linen dress, her hair blowing softly in the sea wind. A few feet away on the lawn, her 2-year-old daughter, Victoria, was taking joyful, tumbling steps across the green grass, her bright laughter echoing through the summer air. Walking beside the little girl, keeping a protective, steadying hand near her shoulder, was William Cross. William was Daniel Cross' younger brother, a brilliant, highly respected maritime attorney who possessed his family's immense old money stability but lacked any of Nathan's fragile, desperate vanity. He looked up at Evelyn and smiled, his eyes filled with a deep, genuine respect that had absolutely nothing to do with her family's billions. Nathan Vance was shown in a brief, dark final montage of reality. He was currently sitting in a small, drab and poorly lit one-bedroom apartment in a forgotten corner of Queens. The wallpaper was peeling at the corners, and the window overlooked a noisy concrete alleyway. He wore a faded, off-the-rack suit that no longer fit his slumping frame. He was sorting through a stack of heavy legal bills and federal court appearance notices, his trembling hands looking old and weathered. He had been completely barred from every country club, financial institution, and high society boardroom from New York to London. He was an absolute ghost in the very city he had once believed he ruled. Clara Voss was shown working behind the counter of a low-end retail clothing boutique in New Jersey, her hands folded over a cheap cash register. Her glittering silver gown ambitions had been permanently turned to ash, her name forever associated with a classless corporate scandal that made her completely unemployable in the world of high finance. The male narrator's voice deepens, slowing down to a rhythmic, measured pace as the camera lingers on Evelyn and William watching Victoria play on the sunlit Rhode Island lawn. When we look closely at the complete ruins of Nathan Vance's empire, it is exceptionally easy for us to focus entirely on the flashy, dramatic downfall, the public arrest, the lost millions, the corporate termination. But the true, Deep moral lesson of this story lies far below the surface of the corporate drama. It lies within the silent, unyielding economy of human relationships. Every single time a man or a woman mistakes their partner's infinite patience for absolute weakness, they are running a massive emotional deficit in their life. Evelyn Vance did not destroy her husband's career. Nathan destroyed himself through his own unyielding arrogance. Evelyn simply stopped paying the financial and emotional bills for his vanity. In our modern high-speed world, we are constantly told by media and culture to react immediately to every single slight. We are told that if someone crosses our boundaries, we must strike back with the exact same volume, the exact same raw anger, and the exact same low, toxic energy. But true power, the kind of absolute power that outlasts entire corporate empires, is completely silent. It is structured. It is rooted in a deep, unshakable sense of self-worth and absolute legal and financial precision. Evelyn did not need to spend her life throwing tantrums or fighting Clara Voss in the mud, because she knew that the system of legal consequence she had built around her life was far heavier than any human hand could ever be. She protected her dignity. She protected her unborn child. And in doing so, she simply allowed the natural laws of gravity to pull her enemies down into the very dirt they had crawled out of. Let this story serve as an absolute, urgent warning to anyone currently sitting at a table of immense success that is funded entirely by someone else's grace. Never, ever mistake your temporary proximity to absolute power for actual ownership of the asset. And to those who are currently enduring silent disrespect and boundary violations in their own homes, do not rush your move out of raw anger. Build your walls quietly. Secure your financial and legal evidence thoroughly. Because a victory won in sudden, reactive anger is always temporary. But a victory won in absolute class and legal certainty is forever. If this story reminded you of the profound power of silent resilience and dignity, hit the like button right now and subscribe immediately to Silent Queen's Reckoning. I want you to drop a comment below with the exact word you change if you believe that a woman's true strength can never be broken by temporary betrayal. Sharing this video helps us continue bringing these deep, psychological narratives of justice and truth to light. Thank you for listening tonight. And always remember, keep your personal standards exceptionally high and your operational strategy completely silent. Until next time, as the sun sets over the ocean in Newport, Rhode Island, and we look at the complete, unmitigated ruin of Nathan Vance's empire, it is incredibly easy to focus only on the flashy, dramatic downfall, the frozen bank accounts, the corporate termination, the sudden loss of status. But the true, deep psychological lesson of this story lies far below the surface of the corporate drama. It lies within the silent, unyielding economy of human relationships. Every single time an ambitious person mistakes their partner's patience for submission, they are running a massive emotional deficit. Evelyn Vance did not destroy her husband's career. Nathan destroyed himself through his own unyielding arrogance. Evelyn simply stopped paying the financial and emotional bills for his vanity. Clara Voss mistook her temporary proximity to absolute power for actual ownership of the asset. She believed that because she organized the calendar and chose the white orchids, she owned the throne. She forgot that being close to the crown is never the same as wearing it. In our modern, high-speed world, culture constantly tells us to react immediately to every single slight. We are told that if someone crosses our boundaries, we must strike back with the exact same volume, the exact same raw anger, and the exact same low toxic energy. We feel the urge to scream, to text back instantly, to make a scene. But true power, the kind of absolute power that outlasts entire corporate empires, is completely silent. It is structured. It is rooted in an unshakable sense of self-worth and absolute legal precision. Evelyn did not need to spend her life throwing tantrums or fighting a desperate mistress in the mud. She knew that the system of legal consequence she had built around her life was far heavier than any human hand could ever be. She protected her dignity. She protected her unborn child. And in doing so, she simply allowed the natural laws of gravity to pull her enemies down into the very dirt they crawled out of. Let this story serve as an absolute, urgent warning to anyone currently sitting at a table of immense success that is funded entirely by someone else's grace. Never bite the hand that feeds your ambition. And to those who are currently enduring silent disrespect, emotional betrayal, or boundary violations in their own lives, do not rush your move out of raw, blinding anger. Build your walls quietly. Secure your financial, emotional, and legal evidence thoroughly. Let them get comfortable in their disrespect. Let them believe they have won, because a victory won in sudden. Reactive anger is always temporary, but a victory won in absolute class. Total silence and legal certainty is forever. This content has been thoroughly researched, crafted, and edited completely by hand to deliver profound meaning, high psychological impact, and valuable life lessons to our audience.